I returned from my mother's bedside, weary and hopeful, only to hear Amanda's muffled cries from the basement. My own children had vanished, leaving betrayal in their wake. How far would I go to reclaim justice? Welcome to your ultimate destination for gripping revenge stories, family betrayals, shocking betrayals, and emotional justice. Dive into tales where heartbreak turns into fury, secrets are exposed, and justice is served. Each story will keep you on the edge of your seat, questioning loyalty, trust, and morality. Subscribe now and join a community that loves suspense, drama, and stories that hit deep, because everyone wants to see justice served. Are you ready to witness the ultimate payback? Now, let's get started. Jacob's car wheels crunched over the gravel driveway, each sound echoing like a heartbeat in his chest. He had just returned from his mother's bedside. 5 days of sterile hospital rooms, the smell of antiseptic clinging to his clothes, and the quiet hum of machines that marked life and death. He had imagined coming home, if only for a few hours, to the familiar warmth of his family, Amanda's smile, the laughter of their children filling the house. But the front door stood unnaturally still. No laughter, no footsteps, only silence. He hung his coat and stepped inside, the air thick with a musty scent he couldn't place. Something was off, too quiet. His brow furrowed as he called out, "Amanda? Kids." His voice echoed in the empty hall, swallowed by shadows. Then he heard it, a faint, metallic thump from below. The basement. Jacob's heart constricted, a cold dread crawling up his spine. The basement door, normally unlocked, was latched tight. He tried the handle, shaking it. Locked. Panic coiled around him. "Amanda!" His voice cracked, sharper this time. Thuds and muffled sobs answered. He yanked the door open, descended the narrow steps, and saw her, Amanda, his wife, sitting on the cold concrete floor, arms wrapped around herself, eyes wide and red. Her hair was tangled, her dress rumpled, and there was a bruise along her arm. She looked both terrified and defiant. "Jacob!" Her whisper was barely audible, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. What happened? Where are the kids?" His voice wavered between confusion and anger. She shook her head, tears spilling freely. They left. Left us. They said they can't stay here anymore. I begged them not to lock me here, but her words faltered, choking on grief. Jacob felt a sick weight in his stomach, nausea and fury colliding. Their children, the very souls he had raised, guided, and loved, had abandoned their mother. Worse, they had trapped her in the basement, left her alone and frightened while they chased riotous freedom. Rage coiled around his chest like iron. He wanted to scream, to shake the walls down, to tear them apart. But even in that fury, he noticed the details. The dust on the floor where she had sat for hours, the faint smell of sweat and fear, the lock itself, crude yet effective. The realization cut deeper than any physical wound. This was not just neglect. This was deliberate, a betrayal that ran through the heart of the family he had built, now broken and bleeding. Jacob knelt beside Amanda, brushing hair from her tear-streaked face. "I swear, I'll fix this. I'll make them pay." His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it simmered a storm, a vow forged in grief, betrayal, and love. Outside, the wind rattled the windows as if echoing his fury. Inside, in the dark basement, Jacob made a silent promise. No child, no one would escape justice. He would reclaim what had been stolen, and he would do it all. The house was quiet once more, but the air was charged, waiting for the storm Jacob was about to unleash. Jacob sat on the edge of the basement steps, the cold concrete pressing into his palms. Amanda's sobs had softened into shallow breaths, but the weight of reality pressed down on him like a leaden shroud. Their children, the very ones he had nurtured, guided, and disciplined, had abandoned not only their mother, but their father's faith in them. Rage and despair mingled, bitter and metallic on his tongue. He thought back to the quiet mornings, the birthday candles, the bedtime stories, small moments he had taken for granted. And now, gone, trampled, replaced by a hollow, suffocating emptiness. The betrayal didn't just sting, it scorched him from within. He could almost hear their laughter in his mind, mocking him from some distant bar, some reckless freedom that didn't include responsibility. Jacob's chest heaved. "How could they do this to us?" he whispered, voice cracking. Amanda rested her head on his shoulder, trembling. "I begged. Jacob, I begged them." Her words were a dagger to his heart. He could picture it all. Their motherly warnings, his attempts at discipline, his reminders of love and consequence. And yet, the children had chosen chaos over family, rebellion over responsibility. Time slowed, stretching each second into an eternity. Jacob's mind raced through every conversation, every moment of neglect he might have caused, every scolding he'd given, searching desperately for a justification, an explanation that could make sense of their cruelty. But there was none, nothing but betrayal. He stood abruptly, the sound of his boots against the concrete echoing like thunder. Jacob's fingers clenched into fists. Rage demanded action. Logic screamed restraint. He felt the blood pound in his ears, a relentless drumbeat that matched his rising fury. He looked at Amanda, bruised, frightened, yet alive, and the fire within him ignited. He could not let this slide. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. Jacob began to inspect the basement, noticing subtle traces of his children's carelessness. A scuff on the floor where they had dragged furniture, a forgotten scarf, a note crumpled and discarded, half-written, mocking. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. They had left their mother imprisoned for hours, perhaps days, without remorse, without thought. Anger, deep and primal, surged through him. His body trembled, not with fear, but with resolve. He would make them understand the magnitude of what they had done, not through shouting, not through pleading, but through calculated justice. Every instinct, every heartbeat, screamed that mercy alone would never suffice. Jacob turned to Amanda, taking her hands in his. "I promise," he said, voice low and unyielding, "I will bring them back. I will make them see, feel the weight of their betrayal." She looked at him, tearful yet steady, sensing the storm that had begun to coil within him. And in that moment, Jacob understood. Innocence was gone. The family he had known was shattered, and only through deliberate action, through vengeance, could he hope to reclaim what had been stolen. Rage and grief fused into something darker, sharper, and undeniable. The seed of revenge had been planted. The house outside remained silent, but Jacob could feel it, the pulse of the storm to come, quiet now, but gathering force. Jacob's world had narrowed to shadows, silence, and the relentless hum of his own thoughts. Days blurred into nights as he paced the empty house, each step echoing like a metronome counting down the hours of his suffering. Amanda remained withdrawn, a fragile presence in the periphery, and the basement, once a prison, now symbolized the breach in their lives, the fracture his children had caused. He barely slept, haunted by the memory of their smirks, the casual cruelty in their eyes. The betrayal gnawed at him, a parasite feeding on his anger and grief. Alone in the dim glow of the kitchen, he spread photographs, receipts, and scraps of messages across the table, evidence of their abandonment, fragments of a life he could no longer trust. Each detail sharpened the blade of his fury. Jacob knew he was crossing a line. He felt it in his bones, the slow, steady shift from protective father to calculating avenger. The thought of confronting the children with mere words seemed laughable. They needed to understand the weight of their betrayal, to feel the emptiness and terror they had left behind. He traced his finger along a crumpled note Amanda had hidden from him, her attempt to shield him from their full recklessness. The words burned in his mind. We're free now. Nothing holds us here. He remembered every warning he had given, every conversation where love and discipline had intertwined. They had shrugged him off, mocking boundaries that once defined the home. And now, Jacob realized his anger was no longer just about punishment. It was about reclaiming control, restoring order to a world that had spun into chaos. Isolation became his ally. Friends' calls went unanswered, work was ignored, and even Amanda's gentle attempts at comfort were met with silent absorption, his mind always turning, always plotting. He found himself replaying scenarios, confrontations, subtle manipulations, moments where he could expose them to consequences without a word of explanation. Each plan, more intricate than the last, seemed simultaneously satisfying and terrifying. Sometimes he caught himself staring at the basement lock, imagining the terror it could induce if applied to those who had wronged him. He hated that thought, hated it with the fervor of a man who feared the darkness within himself. But he could not stop it. The betrayal had lit a fire in him, one that burned hotter with each passing hour. Jacob's descent was not linear. There were moments of doubt, of fleeting guilt, but they were swallowed quickly by the raw intensity of his mission. He recalled Amanda's trembling eyes and realized the line between protection and vengeance was dangerously thin. Every plan, every careful step carried a moral weight that pressed on his conscience. And yet, the thought of inaction, of letting them escape unscathed, was unbearable. By the end of the week, Jacob's mind had transformed the home into a silent battleground. Shadows in corners became watchful eyes, the creaking floorboards a constant reminder of impermanence. He was no longer the man who had returned from his mother's bedside. He was a storm contained within a body, moving toward a reckoning only he could define. The basement door, once a symbol of Amanda's imprisonment, now represented the threshold of his own transformation. Behind it lay grief, fear, and rage, and beyond it awaited the first steps of retribution. Jacob's patience had matured into precision. Every step, every glance, every whispered inquiry was a move on a board only he could see. The betrayal of his children had left scars, but it had also sharpened him, transforming grief into strategy. No longer merely reacting, he became the predator in a game they hadn't even realized they were playing. He started small, anonymously contacting old acquaintances, leaking hints of their irresponsibility and recklessness. Late-night calls to landlords, employers, and former friends painted a subtle picture of the children's chaos. Each ripple sent them stumbling, questioning their choices, and slowly eroding the careless confidence that had fueled their abandonment. Jacob observed from the shadows, never revealing his presence. The air of invisibility made him almost giddy. a stark contrast to the helplessness he had felt in the basement's confines. He watched their reactions through social media updates, overheard conversations, and the occasional casual encounter on the street. They were unaware the web was tightening, that the father they thought powerless was orchestrating every disruption. One evening, Jacob followed his daughter from a raucous gathering. She laughed carelessly with friends, oblivious to the bills unpaid and the mother she had abandoned. His chest burned, a mix of fury and sorrow. He did not intervene, not yet. He allowed her to feel the consequences slowly, like frost creeping over delicate glass. Meanwhile, Amanda's presence reminded him of what he fought for. She moved cautiously around him, a soft anchor to his storm. Jacob realized that every calculated strike was not just about punishment, but also about reclaiming control, about restoring the balance their children had shattered. He would not allow fear alone to guide them. They had to understand the depth of betrayal they had sown. Jacob began orchestrating encounters, subtle and disorienting. A misplaced envelope here, a cryptic note there, small, deliberate shocks designed to make them question their safety, their choices, their morality. Each act was measured, each strike a message wrapped in the shadows of his wrath. At night, he revisited the basement, tracing the contours of its cold, concrete walls, imagining the fear he could instill if he chose to escalate. The memory of Amanda, huddled and terrified, remained his anchor and his fuel. Rage was the flame, but love was the reason it burned so deliberately. As the hunt progressed, Jacob discovered cracks in his children's armor. Arrogance replaced by unease, recklessness replaced by doubt. They were not invincible, not unassailable. He felt satisfaction, but it was tempered by caution. Vengeance, once tasted, could consume the taker as easily as the taken. By the end of this phase, Jacob had become a shadow in their lives, a silent force dismantling their certainty. The children began whispering about bad luck, strange coincidences, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Yet they never suspected the father they had abandoned, the man who had once cradled them through scraped knees and nightmares, had become the architect of their unease. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Jacob knew. The first fractures in their rebellion were appearing. The storm was no longer just brewing. It was moving, deliberate and unstoppable, toward a reckoning only he could deliver. Jacob's carefully orchestrated hunt had begun to bear fruit, but what he uncovered next shook him more deeply than any rage could. Late one night, while following a trail of digital breadcrumbs and old acquaintances, he discovered hidden layers to his children's betrayal, layers he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just rebellion or selfishness. There were secrets, manipulations, hidden alliances. His son had become entangled with a circle of friends who encouraged recklessness, while his daughter had been lured by promises of freedom that masked exploitation. The betrayal wasn't solely theirs. It had been cultivated by outside forces, forces Jacob had never suspected existed. Jacob felt a strange twist of emotions. Anger at the children, yes, but also a surge of guilt. Had he missed something? Was there a failure in his parenting, in the structure he had created at home, that allowed them to fall prey to such influences? Rage clashed with remorse, each demanding dominance in his chest. He returned home, haunted by these revelations. Amanda was there, quiet, her presence a subtle reminder of why he could not allow himself to crumble. "Jacob," she whispered, sensing his inner turmoil. "You're losing yourself in this. Remember why you started." Her words were steady, gentle, a tether to the man he had been before betrayal darkened him. Jacob stared at the basement door, its cold metal now a symbol not only of the children's cruelty, but of his own descent into obsession. He realized that revenge, if carried without understanding, risked turning him into a mirror of the very cruelty he loathed. The path forward had to be precise, measured, not blind fury, but targeted justice. The revelation also reshaped his perception of the children. They were not merely selfish. They were flawed, yes, but manipulated, frightened, and human. This did not absolve them, but it reframed the punishment he considered. The moral stakes became sharper. Vengeance now carried the weight of truth and consequence, rather than mere anger. Jacob revisited the evidence he had gathered, cross-referencing every interaction, every betrayal, every misstep. Patterns emerged. He could see the influence of friends who whispered reckless freedom, of promises that encouraged abandonment, of systems that rewarded their impulsiveness. The children's rebellion, once so simple in his mind, now appeared tangled in threads of deception he had never anticipated. He felt his resolve harden in a different way. Justice could not be mindless. Retribution had to honor truth. He would expose the lies, dismantle the networks that enabled their recklessness, and confront his children not only with the pain of abandonment, but with the reality of their choices. As Jacob sat alone in the dim kitchen, maps and notes spread around him, a plan began to crystallize. This was no longer just personal vengeance. It was a reckoning, a chance to force the children to face consequences that were both just and inescapable. The storm was no longer only emotional. It had become strategic. Every move, every shadow, every calculated encounter would carry the weight of revelation. And in that clarity, Jacob felt the cold thrill of inevitability. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and nothing could stop it. Jacob's isolation had forged a solitary resolve, but he began to realize that vengeance, however precise, was not a path he could walk entirely alone. One evening, while retracing the steps his children had taken during their flight from responsibility, he encountered someone unexpected. Mark, a former family friend who had quietly watched the children's reckless behavior escalate for years. Mark's expression was cautious but earnest. "Jacob, I know what they've done," he said softly, "and I think you're the only one who can make them see the consequences. But you don't have to do it alone." Jacob studied him carefully. Trust had been shattered too many times, but something in Mark's eyes, sorrow, anger, loyalty, resonated with the father within him. Slowly, Jacob nodded. He knew he needed help, not just to execute his plans, but to anchor himself, to keep from crossing lines that would make him no better than those he pursued. Together, they began tracing the children's footsteps, uncovering not only misdeeds, but also the networks that had ensnared them. Every revelation deepened Jacob's understanding of the betrayal. It was not only personal, but systemic, enabled by friends, acquaintances, and even strangers who encouraged recklessness. Amanda watched this alliance form with wary relief. She remained the quiet, stabilizing presence in Jacob's life, the reminder that his vengeance had a purpose, but it could not consume the man he still wished to be. Occasionally, she offered subtle guidance. "Don't forget why you started," or simply a reassuring touch as Jacob returned home late from shadowing the children. Her influence was gentle but firm, the tether that kept him grounded. The alliance, however, was not without friction. Mark and Jacob argued over strategy, whether to strike with exposure, subtle intimidation, or calculated confrontation. Each disagreement revealed Jacob's volatility, his obsession, and his need to maintain control. Yet, over time, trust began to grow, grounded in mutual understanding of both justice and moral restraint. With their combined knowledge, Jacob began orchestrating encounters that forced his children to confront uncomfortable truths. Subtle disruptions in their lives, missed opportunities, exposed lies, and sudden challenges made them pause and question the stability of the world they had believed so free. Every strike carried moral weight, a reflection of the revelation that revenge was not simply punishment, but a mirror to their choices. Jacob also felt something unexpected, a flicker of humanity returning. Through the alliance, he realized he could channel his rage not into cruelty, but into precision. He could strike without losing himself entirely, guided by purpose rather than pure anger. It was a revelation as profound as any he had unearthed about his children. And yet, the shadow of doubt lingered. Trust was fragile, and the deeper the alliance drew him into their network, the more he realized that betrayal could come from anywhere, even those closest to him. But for now, Mark's presence was a lifeline, a partner in the methodical reclamation of justice, and a reminder that Jacob's path was not irreversibly solitary. As he left Amanda's side that night, Jacob felt the storm within him sharpen. The hunt had evolved into something more, a calculated, strategic pursuit tempered by alliances and moral clarity. And in the quiet hum of the house, he knew the reckoning was drawing closer, and when it came, every action would carry the weight of both vengeance and truth. Jacob had grown confident, precise, and methodical. Each calculated move against his children had begun to yield results. Cracks in their arrogance, moments of hesitation, glimpses of fear. Yet, the deeper he delved into the intricate web of their betrayal, the more he sensed the fragility of the alliances he had formed. One evening, a message arrived from Mark, ostensibly providing critical information about the children's whereabouts and latest indiscretions. Jacob followed the lead, preparing for what he thought would be a decisive step in reclaiming justice. But as he executed the plan, events spiraled unexpectedly. The children had been tipped off. What Jacob believed was a private, unseen strike became public embarrassment for Amanda, his home, and even himself. Panic and humiliation rippled through the household. Jacob realized with a sinking dread that Mark had misled him deliberately or negligently, and the setback cut deeper than any betrayal the children had inflicted. Rage flared, scorching him from within. He had trusted someone again, allowed another soul to share the weight of his vengeance, and now that trust had been weaponized against him. Amanda's eyes, wide with fear and disappointment, reminded him that even in the pursuit of justice, he was vulnerable, capable of being deceived, of miscalculating, of hurting those he loved most. Jacob retreated to the basement that night, the cold concrete pressing against his palms. He stared at the walls where Amanda had once been imprisoned, imagining the ironic mirror. He, too, trapped by obsession and betrayal. His reflection in the darkened windows seemed strange, foreign. A man teetering dangerously close to becoming the cruelty he sought to punish. The betrayal forced a brutal introspection. How much of his current self was Jacob, and how much was the vengeance-consuming shadow he had become? Each plan, each strike, was now tainted by the possibility of error, deception, and moral compromise. The lines blurred. Punishment and cruelty were no longer easily distinguishable. Yet, within the darkness, clarity emerged. The setback was not the end, it was a lesson. Jacob's pursuit of justice required sharper discernment, stricter boundaries, and above all, recognition that alliances carried risks. He could not allow the children's betrayal, nor Mark's failure, to derail the ultimate reckoning. He would adjust, recalibrate, and move forward with renewed purpose. Jacob also confronted a harsher truth. In his quest for vengeance, he had committed acts that mirrored the recklessness of his children: manipulation, surveillance, and subtle intimidation. Each justified by anger, yet morally ambiguous, each leaving its mark on his conscience. This was the darkest hour, the point at which the hunter recognized the peril of becoming indistinguishable from the hunted. By dawn, Jacob emerged from the basement with a resolve sharpened by shadow. Betrayal, whether from children or allies, would no longer sway him. He would continue his pursuit of justice, tempered by the lesson that vengeance carried a price, and that the cost could be his soul if he allowed himself to lose sight of purpose. The storm within him had not abated, it had matured. The reckoning loomed closer than ever, but Jacob now understood the balance he needed to strike between fury and moral clarity. One misstep, one blind act could undo everything. And yet, he would not stop. The air in the house was electric, heavy with anticipation. Jacob had spent weeks orchestrating every encounter, every subtle disruption, every moment designed to force his children to confront the consequences of their betrayal. Now, the time for subtlety was over. The reckoning had arrived. He confronted his daughter first, cornering her in a small, dimly lit cafe where she thought she was meeting friends. Jacob's presence was calm, but every line of his body radiated controlled fury. She froze, a faint tremor in her hands betraying the bravado she had worn like armor. "You left her locked in our basement," Jacob said quietly, voice steady but cutting. "Do you understand what that means?" The fear, the helplessness. She stammered, trying to deflect, to explain, but Jacob's gaze bore into her, unyielding. Every word, every hesitation reflected the recklessness of her choices, the irresponsibility she had cloaked in freedom. He did not shout, he did not strike, yet the weight of judgment was suffocating, and she felt it in every muscle of her body. Next came his son, who met him in the apartment where he had been living recklessly, indifferent to the destruction left in his wake. Jacob laid bare the evidence of manipulation, deceit, and the consequences that had begun to follow their rebellion. He revealed every truth he had uncovered, the friends who encouraged their recklessness, the lies they had spun, and the fragile trust they had shattered. Tears came, hesitation, fear, the first flickers of comprehension. Jacob listened, watching the transformation, knowing that vengeance could be delivered without blood, without cruelty, yet still leave an indelible mark. Amanda entered at the final moment, a quiet anchor, her presence both comforting and stern. She had endured, she had survived, and she had forgiven enough to temper Jacob's fury. Together, they confronted their children, not with violence, but with the unyielding force of moral clarity. Jacob realized that in exposing the full truth, in presenting both the betrayal and the complexity behind it, he was enacting justice in its most potent form. His children had no escape. They could no longer hide behind ignorance or arrogance. The reckoning was not revenge in its rawest form. It was the illumination of truth, the confrontation of consequences, and the reflection of responsibility back upon them. For Jacob, the catharsis was profound. Rage had driven him this far, but clarity guided him now. Every choice, every word exacted a cost, yet it was measured, precise, and irrevocable. He felt the storm within begin to dissipate, replaced by something heavier and steadier. Understanding, justice, and the quiet echo of redemption. As the children sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of their actions, Jacob stepped back. The reckoning was complete, but he had not allowed it to destroy him. The basement, once a site of imprisonment and fear, had become a symbol of clarity, a threshold crossed from pain to resolution, from fury to measured justice. And in that silence, Jacob understood the profound truth. Vengeance had its place, but moral clarity, exposure of truth, and measured consequence could transform destruction into awakening. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake the calm clarity of a father who had confronted betrayal and emerged whole. The house was quiet now, but the silence carried the weight of all that had transpired. Jacob moved through the room slowly, each step deliberate, absorbing the echoes of the storm that had passed. Amanda followed, her hand brushing his, a quiet reassurance that the world they had known was fractured, yet survivable. Their children sat across from them, subdued and chastened. The reckoning had left its mark, not with violence, but with truth. Faces once proud and indifferent now carried the unmistakable traces of comprehension and regret. They understood, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of the betrayal they had wrought, the fear they had caused, and the consequences they could no longer deny. Jacob walked past the basement, its door now unlocked. He lingered for a moment, tracing the cold metal with his fingers, remembering Amanda's terrified eyes, the bruises, the trembling pleas for mercy. The basement had been the crucible of his pain, the spark of his fury, and now it symbolized endurance, clarity, and justice delivered. It was a reminder of the darkness he had traversed and the light he had reclaimed on the other side. Amanda's voice broke the silence. "We survived," she said softly. Her eyes met his, steady and understanding. "We survived because you faced it all without losing yourself entirely." Jacob exhaled, a slow release of tension that had gripped him for weeks. Rage had been a tool, vengeance a method, but now what remained was something deeper. Comprehension, balance, and a cautious sense of hope. The storm within him had settled into calm, leaving only the resolve to rebuild, to guide, and to heal. The children, now seated quietly, avoided eye contact, but Jacob could see the flicker of recognition, the first sign of accountability. There was no absolution yet, no forgiveness freely given, but there was understanding. And in understanding, there was potential for repair. Jacob reflected on the journey, the isolation, the plotting, the alliances, the betrayals within, the revelations, and the reckoning. Every act of vengeance had carried a cost, some paid in frustration, some in sleepless nights, some in moral compromise. And yet, through it all, he had maintained a tether to what mattered most: truth, responsibility, and the fragile bonds of family. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, a subtle reminder that life moved forward. The children would face consequences still, perhaps legal, social, or personal. But Jacob had delivered justice not as a blind fury, but as a measured force that left them with no escape from the truth of their actions. He turned to Amanda, taking her hand fully this time, no trace of bitterness or lingering anger, only resolve and love. "We've weathered it," he said quietly. "We can rebuild together." And as they stood together in the stillness of the home, Jacob understood something profound. Revenge could consume, it could wound, it could corrupt, but when tempered by clarity, love, and moral judgment, it could transform pain into justice, chaos into understanding, and betrayal into a foundation for renewal. The basement door closed gently behind him, not as a prison, but as a reminder of the journey they had endured. The past could not be undone, but the future, fractured, uncertain, yet alive, waited for them, a world where accountability, justice, and cautious hope coexisted. The storm had passed. The house, the family, and Jacob himself had emerged forever changed, stronger, wiser, and painfully whole. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.